In terms of regulation, you may have heard about the CE sign, right? And CE marking process, actually, if you look at your iPhone on the back, you have a CE mark on it, right? And CE means that your product or the product is in compliance with European directives and regulations. And for medical devices, there are 3 regulations. One is the Medical Devices Directive for kind of general medical devices. Then there is the Active Implantable Medical Devices Directive, AIMD, for pacemakers and other technologies. And then there's an in vitro diagnostic directive. And essentially, you get the CE sign if you can show that your product is in compliance with the directives and regulations that are outlined by the European Union. So there's one in all EU 27 countries, there's one regulatory system. Didn't used to be that way before 95, 96, or 93, actually, when the first directive was introduced. Every country had their own regulatory system in Europe. And so it was very tedious, actually, to go and introduce products into the market. Since then, there's one regulatory system. And we'll see in a minute when I talk about reimbursement. On the reimbursement side, you have still a country-by-country process. But in regulation, it's one system. What is very different to the US is that you have a system of so-called notified bodies for fee service consultancies that you as a manufacturer need to interact with, and they review your product and make sure or confirm that you're in compliance with the regulations. The European regulatory system focuses more on safety, and it doesn't include the focus on effectiveness that FDA in the US has, and therefore it's oftentimes perceived to date as being more friendly to innovation. So main focus on safety, and then some focus on performance, but not effectiveness. And performance means that the product actually performs what it's supposed to do. For example, if you have a scalpel, then it's cutting tissue, but they're not interested or not looking at the long-term outcomes that you can achieve with a certain procedure. When you compare that to the US regulatory system, you have a similar structure of a risk-based system, so 3 classes or 4 classes actually in Europe, but class 1, class 2A, class 2B, and class 3, again with the thought or idea that you want to regulate kind of low-risk devices with a lower burden compared to high-risk devices. When you look at European class 3 devices, they're, like in the US, always required to submit clinical trials, or you have to submit clinical trial information. That's again for pacemakers, for example. There's no 510K process. The 510K process in the US means that you demonstrate substantial equivalence to an existing product. That type of process doesn't exist in Europe. And a couple of other differences. There is the quality systems regulation in the US that FDA actually enforces and checks on. And in Europe, you need to comply with the ISO certification 13485. And the notified bodies actually work with you in certifying you and ensuring that you're compliant. There is some discussion right now at the European Commission. There's a proposal for reform of European regulation, but that's still needs to go before the Commission and the Parliament, and actually is not decided yet. But there might be changes requiring more clinical data, and then this difference between US and Europe in terms of ease of access to the markets might change. We did a study a couple of years ago looking at 510K type products and the approval or clearance times in various markets. And you see here, Japan has always been very slow, but the US definitely lags compared to the European markets in terms of time to market. And actually what you see oftentimes is that many US companies bring products to the European market first because they can get it onto the market first and more quickly. Some PMA high-risk devices actually get to the European market oftentimes 4 or 5 years before they get to the US market, because FDA needs and wants to see more information, more data, and longer follow-up.